Raw aggression meets unshakable discipline. It begins with a thug baseball bat in hand confronting a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. What follows is a masterclass in control, training, and the quiet power of professionalism. This isn't just a fight, it's a moment that separates chaos from character. If you believe in honor under pressure, hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Let's begin. The autumn evening cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, where the ancient stones seemed to hold the weight of centuries within their weathered surfaces. The tourist crowds had thinned considerably as darkness approached, leaving only the most dedicated sightseers and the ever-present royal guards maintaining their stoic vigil. Among these sentinels stood James Harrison, a man whose 28 years had been carved by experiences that would break lesser individuals. Harrison's military record read like a testament to British valor. Royal Marines Commando training at age 18, followed by deployments to Afghanistan's Helmand province, where he had earned his stripes under the harshest conditions imaginable. 2 tours of duty had taught him lessons that no civilian could. Truly comprehend how to read danger in a man's posture, how to calculate threat levels in milliseconds, and most importantly, how to respond with measured but devastating precision when the moment demanded it. The transition from active combat to ceremonial duty might have seemed like a step down to some, but Harrison understood the deeper meaning of his current role. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace wasn't just about looking impressive for tourists. It was about representing the unbreakable spirit of British military tradition. Every day, he put on the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat, not as a costume, but as armor carrying the weight of history and responsibility. On this particular evening, as the last rays of sunlight reflected off the palace windows, Harrison noticed something that made his trained instincts prickle with unease. Among the dispersing crowd, one figure moved with a different energy, purposeful, aggressive, and carrying something that didn't belong in the hands of a tourist. The man was tall and lean, perhaps in his mid-20s, wearing a black hoodie that seemed designed to conceal rather than comfort. But it was the wooden object in his right hand that caught Harrison's attention, a baseball bat, its surface scarred from use, being tapped rhythmically against the man's palm. Marcus Thorne had arrived at Buckingham Palace with a head full of rage and a heart full of desperation. 3 months of unemployment, 2 failed relationships, and a lifetime of feeling invisible had crystallized into a singular, dangerous idea. In his twisted logic, attacking a royal guard would make him famous, feared, respected, everything. He felt he wasn't. The bat in his hands wasn't just a weapon. It was his ticket to notoriety, his declaration of war against a world that had ignored him for too long. The remaining tourists sensed the shift in atmosphere before they could identify its source. Conversations became more subdued, children moved closer to their parents, and several people began discreetly backing away from the barriers that separated visitors from the guards. Harrison remained motionless, but every fiber of his being was now focused on the approaching threat. His peripheral vision tracked Marcus's movement, while his conscious mind ran through threat assessment protocols that had been drilled into him during countless hours of training. Marcus approached the barrier with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His criminal record, though modest by some standards, included bar fights, vandalism, and a disturbing pattern of escalating violence that social services had failed to address. Tonight, that pattern was about to reach its logical conclusion. "Look at this guy," Marcus muttered to himself, his voice carrying the particular brand of bravado that comes from liquid courage and genuine desperation. He had been drinking since noon, not enough to impair his coordination, but sufficient to silence the small voice in his head that might have urged caution. Standing there like he's hot shit. "Let's see how tough you really are, tin soldier." The few remaining tourists began to realize that something was very wrong. A family from Scotland, the MacLeods, quickly ushered their 2 young children behind a large stone pillar. Margaret MacLeod, a nurse from Edinburgh, recognized the look in Marcus's eyes. She had seen it before in the emergency room. The dangerous combination of rage and recklessness that preceded violence. "Call the police," she whispered urgently to her husband. But Donald MacLeod was already reaching for his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he realized they were about to witness something terrible. A group of American exchange students from the University of London had been taking selfies near the gates when they noticed Marcus's approach. Jessica Chen, a pre-med student from California, felt her stomach drop as she recognized the unmistakable signs of impending violence. She had grown up in a rough neighborhood and knew that posture, that walk, that barely contained aggression. That preceded an explosion. "We need to get out of here," she whispered to her friends. But like witnesses to a traffic accident, they found themselves unable to look away from the unfolding drama. Marcus stepped over the protective barrier with deliberate casualness, as if crossing an invisible line that had kept order at this location for centuries was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The act itself was a violation of protocol, but more than that, it was a declaration of intent. No tourist accidentally crossed that barrier. It was clearly marked, well-defined, and respected by thousands of visitors every day. Harrison's training kicked into high gear. His breathing remained controlled and steady, but his heart rate increased slightly as his body prepared for combat. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that separated a confused tourist from a genuine threat, and everything about Marcus screamed danger. The bat, the posture, the deliberate boundary violation, the look in his eyes, all of it pointed to imminent violence. The guards' peripheral vision catalogued potential civilians in the danger zone, escape routes, backup positions, and tactical advantages. His rifle, while primarily ceremonial in this context, was fully functional and loaded. But Harrison's training dictated that he should use minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat. A drunk with a baseball bat didn't require lethal force. It required precise, overwhelming non-lethal response. Marcus raised the bat above his head, his muscles tensing as he prepared to swing. The wooden weapon, a Louisville slugger with chips and scratches that told the story of previous violence, caught the last rays of evening sunlight. For a moment, the entire scene seemed frozen in time. The ancient palace walls, the modern threat, the centuries-old tradition of the Royal Guard about to meet 21st-century street violence. "Yo, Tin Man," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls with ugly aggression. "Let's see if you can take a hit." The words were slurred just enough to confirm Harrison's suspicion about alcohol involvement, but not enough to suggest that Marcus was incapacitated. This was a man in control of his actions, which made him even more dangerous. The remaining tourists gasped collectively. Several people screamed, and at least a dozen phones appeared, as if by magic, their cameras capturing what promised to be either a tragedy or a demonstration of British military prowess. The moment stretched like a taut wire, filled with potential energy that was about to be released in explosive fashion. The swing came with all the force Marcus could muster, the bat cutting through the air with a whistling sound that spoke of genuine intent to cause serious harm. But Marcus had made a fundamental error in judgment. He had assumed that the guard's stillness indicated helplessness, that the ceremonial nature of the posting meant the man behind the uniform was merely decorative. Harrison moved with the fluid precision of a man who had dodged actual bullets in actual combat zones. The sidestep was economical, efficient, and perfectly timed. The bat missed his head by inches, the wind from its passage ruffling the plume on his bearskin hat. But more importantly, Marcus's aggressive swing had left him completely off balance, committed to a motion that couldn't be stopped or redirected. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would be analyzed and reanalyzed in slow motion by millions of viewers in the days to come. Harrison's rifle, held in the traditional, ceremonial position, became a weapon of devastating efficiency. The stock of the weapon, designed to be gripped firmly during firing, made contact with Marcus's right wrist with surgical precision. The sound of breaking bone was audible, even over the gasps and screams of the witnesses. Marcus's wrist snapped, with a wet crack that made several onlookers physically sick. The baseball bat, suddenly freed from his grip, spun through the air in a lazy arc before clattering onto the ancient cobblestones with a hollow thud that seemed to echo the finality of Marcus's miscalculation. But Harrison wasn't finished. His combat training had taught him that neutralizing a weapon wasn't enough. The threat itself had to be completely eliminated. As Marcus stumbled forward, his face contorted in shock and pain, Harrison pivoted with ballet-like grace. His elbow, hardened by years of training and combat, drove into Marcus's ribcage with calculated force. The impact drove the air from Marcus's lungs in a whooshing gasp that sounded like a deflating balloon. His forward momentum, combined with the force of the elbow strike, sent him stumbling sideways. But Harrison's final move was perhaps the most impressive. a perfectly executed leg sweep that caught Marcus's ankles and sent him crashing to the ground with bone-jarring impact. Marcus hit the cobblestones hard, his body making a sound like a sack of grain being dropped from a great height. The impact drove what little air remained in his lungs out through his mouth in a pained wheeze. His right wrist, clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle that made several witnesses turn away in disgust. But it was the look of absolute shock on his face that truly captured the magnitude of his miscalculation. Harrison's boot, polished to mirror brightness and weighted with the authority of centuries of military tradition, came to rest on Marcus's chest with exactly enough pressure to keep him immobilized without causing additional injury. The guard's face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed on the writhing figure beneath his foot, calculating whether additional force would be necessary. "Stay down," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from having ordered men in life-and-death situations. The words weren't shouted or aggressive, they didn't need to be. They carried the weight of absolute certainty, the voice of a man who had never been disobeyed when lives were at stake. Marcus tried to speak, but could only produce a strangled whimper as pain from his broken wrist and bruised ribs made coherent thought nearly impossible. The alcohol that had given him courage minutes earlier now made his injuries feel even more severe. The chemical numbness unable to compete with the very real physical trauma he had just experienced. The witnesses stood in stunned silence for several heartbeats before erupting into a chaos of voices, phone cameras, and nervous energy. The American exchange students found themselves cheering despite their shock, their voices joining a growing chorus of approval from the gathered crowd. "Did you see that?" Jessica Chen exclaimed to her friends, her medical training allowing her to appreciate the precision of Harrison's response. "That was incredible. He neutralized the threat without killing him." The Scottish family emerged from behind their stone pillar, the children's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Young Jamie MacLeod, only 8 years old, would later tell his classmates that he had seen a real soldier fight a bad man, his description growing more elaborate with each telling. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the evening air like a mechanical banshee wail, growing louder with each passing second. The Metropolitan Police response was swift and professional. 2 armed response vehicles and a standard patrol car arrived within 4 minutes of the initial emergency call, their blue lights painting the ancient palace walls in strobing patterns of urgency. Inspector Sarah Coleman was the first officer to assess the scene, her 20 years of experience allowing her to quickly process the tableau before her. 1 suspect down with obvious injuries, 1 royal guard maintaining professional posture, and approximately 30 witnesses in various states of excitement and shock. Her trained eye immediately noted the broken baseball bat lying several feet away from the suspect, its position and the guard's stance, telling the story more clearly than any witness statement could. Right then, Inspector Coleman announced, as her officers secured the perimeter, "Let's sort this out properly." She approached Harrison with the respect due to a fellow professional, recognizing immediately that this was no ordinary ceremonial guard, but a trained soldier who had just successfully defended himself and the public. "Guard Harrison," she said, having quickly identified him from his service number. "Are you injured? Do you require medical attention?" Harrison's response was textbook military precision. "No injuries, Inspector. Threat has been neutralized and secured. Suspect appears to have sustained a broken wrist and possible rib injuries during the altercation. Weapon has been secured." His voice carried no satisfaction, no boasting, simply the factual report of a professional who had done his job. Meanwhile, the paramedics had arrived and were assessing Marcus's condition. The broken wrist was obvious, but they were more concerned about potential internal injuries from the elbow strike and possible head trauma from his impact with the cobblestones. Marcus was conscious but clearly in significant pain, his earlier bravado replaced by whimpering complaints about police brutality and demands for painkillers. The witnesses were eager to provide their accounts, each version painting Marcus as the clear aggressor and Harrison as a hero who had shown remarkable restraint. Margaret MacLeod, the nurse from Edinburgh, provided the most medically accurate assessment of the injuries, while the American students offered multiple phone videos of the incident from different angles. As Marcus was loaded into the ambulance, still complaining about the unfairness of his situation and demanding that someone pay for his injuries, Inspector Coleman began the formal process of documenting the incident. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, video footage from tourists' phones, and physical evidence that clearly supported a case of self-defense against an armed assault, Harrison provided his statement with the same professional demeanor he had maintained throughout the incident. His account was precise, factual, and completely devoid of emotion. He described Marcus's approach, the threat assessment process, the moment of attack, and his measured response. The inspector found herself impressed not just by the guard's combat effectiveness, but by his ability to use exactly the right amount of force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. He showed remarkable restraint. Guard Harrison, Inspector Coleman noted as she concluded her interview. A less experienced officer might have used lethal force in that situation. Harrison's response was characteristic of his training and personality. The suspect posed a significant threat, but not one that required lethal response. My training emphasizes proportional force and civilian safety. The situation was resolved with minimal collateral damage. The crowd was slowly dispersing, but many witnesses lingered, still processing what they had witnessed. The American exchange students were already uploading their videos to social media, their posts accompanied by commentary about British military training and the professionalism of the Royal Guards. The Scottish family was heading back to their hotel, the children still buzzing with excitement about the real soldier they had seen in action. Word of the incident was spreading through unofficial channels as well. Other Royal Guards at different posts received discreet updates through their communication network, while palace security reviewed the footage from their surveillance cameras to ensure they had complete documentation of the event. By the time the formal interviews were completed and the scene was cleared, it was nearly midnight. Harrison returned to his post with the same stoic dedication he had shown before the incident, as if violent confrontations were just another part of his daily routine. In many ways, given his military background, they were. The story broke on social media before it hit traditional news outlets, as was increasingly common in the digital age. The first video, posted by Jessica Chen with the caption "Royal Guard absolutely destroys thug with baseball bat. This is why you don't mess with trained soldiers," had gained 10,000 views within the first hour. By morning, it would have millions. The hashtag #RoyalGuardJustice began trending on Twitter, with users sharing the various video angles and adding their own commentary. The general consensus was overwhelmingly supportive of Harrison's actions, with many users praising his restraint and professionalism. Military veterans from around the world chimed in with their own analysis of the guard's technique, most noting the precision and control displayed in what could have been a lethal encounter. Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, was spending his first night in custody at a London hospital, his broken wrist properly set and his ribs x-rayed for fractures. The alcohol had worn off, leaving him with both physical pain and the dawning realization of how completely he had miscalculated the situation. The duty solicitor assigned to his case had already explained that he was facing charges of assault with a deadly weapon, threatening behavior, and violation of royal protocol, charges that could result in several years in prison. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his quest for notoriety had indeed succeeded, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of being feared as the man who took down a royal guard, he was becoming a laughingstock as the thug who got destroyed by superior training and discipline. The videos showing his confident approach, followed immediately by his complete defeat, were being shared with mocking commentary around the world. Traditional media picked up the story in the early morning hours, with BBC News leading their morning broadcast with footage of the incident. The reporter, standing outside Buckingham Palace with the familiar red-coated guards visible in the background, described it as a textbook example of proportional force and professional restraint in the face of armed aggression. The international reaction to the incident was swift and largely positive. Military personnel from allied nations praised Harrison's handling of the situation, with many noting that his response demonstrated the high caliber of training provided. 2 British soldiers, American Marines, in particular, shared the videos widely, with comments like "This is what real military training looks like," and "Perfect example of controlled aggression." The palace released a brief statement commending Guard Harrison for his professionalism and reaffirming the public that the Royal Guards were highly trained soldiers, capable of defending themselves and the crown. The statement also reminded visitors that the Guards were not merely ceremonial figures but active military personnel deserving of respect and appropriate distance. Marcus's family, meanwhile, was dealing with their own humiliation. His mother, interviewed by a local newspaper, expressed embarrassment at her son's actions, while also claiming that the guard had used excessive force. Her comments were largely dismissed by readers who had seen the videos, with most noting that Harrison had shown remarkable restraint in not using lethal force against an armed attacker. The legal proceedings moved swiftly. Marcus was charged, formally while still in the hospital, with his bail set high enough to ensure he remained in custody until trial. His court-appointed lawyer advised him to plead guilty and hope for leniency, explaining that the video evidence made any other defense strategy hopeless. The incident also sparked broader discussions about tourist behavior at royal sites and the respect due to military personnel. Tour guides began incorporating the story into their presentations, using it as an example of why the barriers and protocols around the guards existed for everyone's safety. Guard Harrison, for his part, continued his duties without any apparent change in demeanor or behavior. His commanding officer noted in his file that the incident had been handled with exemplary professionalism and recommended him for commendation. The other guards treated the incident as a learning experience, reviewing the tactics used and discussing how similar situations might be handled in the future. 3 months after the incident, the long-term consequences had become clear for all involved. Marcus Thorne pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with an additional 2 years of probation upon release. The judge noted during sentencing that while the defendant's injuries were regrettable, they were the direct result of his own violent actions against a person lawfully defending themselves and the public. The trial itself became something of a media circus, with the courtroom packed with journalists and curious observers. The prosecution's case was straightforward, multiple video angles showing Marcus attacking a guard who responded with appropriate defensive force. The defense's attempts to portray Marcus as a victim of excessive force fell flat when the videos clearly showed Harrison using minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat. Guard Harrison was called to testify, and his appearance in court demonstrated the same professional demeanor he had shown during the incident itself. His testimony was clear, factual, and completely without malice toward his attacker. When asked by the defense attorney if he regretted his actions, Harrison's response became a quote that was widely shared. "I regret that the situation escalated to violence, but I do not regret protecting myself and the civilians present." The incident had broader implications for security protocols at royal sites. Additional barriers were installed to make it more difficult for individuals to approach the guards, and security camera coverage was enhanced to ensure complete documentation of any future incidents. Tourist information was updated to more clearly explain that the royal guards were active military personnel with full authority to defend themselves. The story became part of military training folklore, used in academies and training centers. As an example of proper threat assessment and proportional response, Harrison himself was eventually promoted and transferred to a training position where he could pass on his experience to younger soldiers. Marcus, serving his sentence, found that prison life gave him ample time to reflect on the choices that had led to his humiliation. The other inmates showed him little sympathy, with many expressing the view that anyone stupid enough to attack a trained soldier deserved whatever happened to them. His broken wrist healed properly, but the psychological scars of his very public defeat took much longer to fade. The videos of the incident continued to circulate years later, often appearing in compilations of instant karma and don't mess with the military content. Each viewing served as a reminder that actions have consequences, and that the difference between ceremony and capability can be measured in seconds when violence erupts. Guard Harrison returned to his post the day after the incident, standing with the same stoic dedication that had characterized his service before his brief moment of internet fame. The tourists who passed by him had no way of knowing they were looking at a man who had perfectly demonstrated the warrior spirit that lay beneath the ceremonial uniform, and that, perhaps, was exactly as it should be, the quiet professionalism of those who serve, ready to act when duty demands, but never seeking glory for simply doing their job. The ancient stones of Buckingham Palace had witnessed another chapter in the long story of British military tradition, where discipline, training, and measured response had triumphed over aggression and chaos. The guards continued their eternal watch, protectors of both crown and country, standing ready to face whatever threats might emerge from the crowds that gathered daily to witness their steadfast vigil.